and welcome to the livecast. My name is Glen Scrivener, and we have a very special guest tuning in from. Where are you tuning in from, Michael Otts?
I'm in Marlow, which not many people have heard of. Buckinghamshire, about halfway between Oxford and London.
Sounds pretty nice. Is it lovely?
It is pretty lovely, actually. We're on the River Thames, so we're about 10 metres that way. We're on the river, and yeah, it's a pretty beautiful part of the country.
Amazing. And you traversed the River Thames quite recently. What was this madcap adventure?
Yeah, I read Three Men in a Boat a couple of months ago, and it kind of gave me the idea of heading down the River Thames, not in a boat, but on my paddleboard. So a few years ago, taught stand-up paddleboarding for a summer, and we recently bought paddleboards, Rebecca and I, and so she dropped me off in Cricklade, over in Gloucestershire, and then I spent 7 days paddling to Teddington, which is the last lock before it becomes tidal on the Thames. So thankfully, I had done a little tester the week before because I was assuming I'd be able to paddle about 50 miles a day. Then I realised if you paddle for about 12 hours really hard, you get about 20, 25 miles. So
wow.
It's about the slowest way of getting from A to B invented.
Yes, the paddleboard. Okay. But you're going downstream, I take it.
Yeah, unfortunately, the stream doesn't flow very fast at all in the summer.
Right.
It's a lot faster doing it in January.
Okay. How fun.
Holiday.
And what do you do while you're paddling? What does the idle mind of Michael Otts, where does it turn?
This is going to sound really cheesy, but I listen to podcasts and Speak Live.
Of course you do. You just binge all of Speak Live's material.
I'm not making that up. I did listen to several Speak Live casts. But basically, I listen to quite a lot of stuff. So audiobooks. So I have lots of audiobooks on my phone. So I listen to that. Listen to podcasts. Watch the world go by. Chat to people you meet.
Sounds amazing.
Just enjoy being outside.
Wow. Tell me, what do you do day by day? And before lockdown hit, what was your pattern?
Yeah, we all have like pre-COVID, post-COVID lives, don't we?
Right.
Pre-COVID, I was working as an evangelist with university students. Well, I still am really, but in a kind of different way at the moment. But speaking at weeks of events that student groups organised, both here in the UK and in other parts of Europe. Explaining the Christian faith and engaging with people's questions. So that normally took me away a lot. So I'd be traveling to different universities around Europe, doing weeks like that, and then involved in training Christian students to be able to hopefully better share their faith and answer the questions that their friends might have. So that's kind of pre-COVID. Post-COVID, I've been doing that, but just doing it all from my dining room at the end of a computer. So I was in Kazakhstan a couple of days ago, speaking to the Kazakh group. It's a lot easier and cheaper, but it's not quite so much fun when you don't get to leave.
Yeah, when you're just in two dimensions and using only 2 of the 5 senses, it's not exactly the same, is it? But how long have you worn the evangelist's hat for?
So I guess it was probably about the age of 18 that I'd become a Christian, come to faith much younger, probably about the age of 7, through the Sunday school at our local church. But I think it was probably about the age of 18 that I had a really kind of strong sense that, hey, if this is really true, and I think it is, and if this is really, really important, and I think it is, then this is something I really want to share with others. And so kind of out of the blue, really, I suddenly had a very real strong conviction, we might say, that's something I wanted to share, to communicate to others. And so I ended up studying theology for 3 years, and then working for a church for 5 years as their evangelist on staff in Bournemouth. And then since that, really, for the last 12 or so years, been involved in, I guess we call it itinerant evangelism, although a friend of mine who's an itinerant evangelist stopped using that term when he got a letter saying, "Dear illiterate evangelist." So, but I guess traveling, say I'm based in Marlow, used to be based in Bournemouth, but most of my ministry, my work is in other places.
Mm-hmm. And mostly directed towards students, or not universally, but
not universally, but mostly it has. Actually, during lockdown, I've ended up doing a lot more stuff for local churches, partly because it's kind of easy. You can go anywhere you can from your living room. So that's been really good, and always been very involved in whichever local church I've been part of. I think that's been really important and really helpful too.
So as you've been paddling down the Thames and listening to the Speak Life podcasts, you've probably caught the last couple of episodes where we've spoken about cancel culture, and we've had this survey of unpopular or unsayable opinions, and we gathered together about 2,500 unsayable opinions, and we've been Paul Feasy and myself batting back and forth. What does this mean about how Christians should think about speech? What does it make you think of as an evangelist? Are you worried by cancel culture? Are there opportunities surrounding these issues? How do you react as an evangelist?
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking at everything that's going on. I think if you kind of look at Twitter and social media, you kind of get this impression that the whole world thinks a certain way, and we're very much not in that world most of the time, in terms of our beliefs, our worldview, our philosophy of life, and so on. And so that can feel a little bit disconcerting. You kind of think like, gosh, I really kind of, don't fit in here. And yet, and I think you spoke about this, the kind of the range of views that kind of social media often presents isn't often reflective of the kind of range of views that are in our society more generally. And so if you just look at social media, it's quite easy to feel a little bit kind of like, do I dare say anything? But then you start chatting to your neighbours, you start chatting to, my wife's work colleagues and stuff like that, and you realise, actually, there's a lot of people out there who are saying, what's going on in our world? And I don't necessarily agree with kind of the zeitgeist of whatever the latest thing is in the media and social media particularly. And so I think if we have courage to say, our aim is not to be liked in a particular sphere of public opinion, then that's okay. If our aim is basically to be really liked, then it's going to be really a real challenge.
Yes.
And I guess equally, if our aim is to be really hated, that's probably not very good either. You get some Christians who just get off on being disliked, and it's like, yes, I'm really blessed because everyone hates me now.
Yes. I think I always say, persecution is our context, but it should never become our complex. And there are many people for whom it is their complex, and they almost court it. And I was interested in the survey. A lot of Christians responding, and a lot of the unsayable opinions were things like Jesus is Lord. And I very much hope that nevertheless, our Christian brothers and sisters are, confident enough to say Jesus is Lord, even if it is considered unsayable in one way or another. And I don't know. I wonder whether one of the lessons to learn is that we need a bit of a thicker skin as Christians, and perhaps we've had it our way for far too long. The Christian worldview being dominant in the West for over 1,000 years. That means we are unused to the kind of pushback that Christians around the world and down through history have historically had, and maybe we're needing to learn a bit of courage, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something I've often pointed out when questions about kind of the biblical view of sexual ethics comes up, for instance. Christianity was countercultural in the first century. We have this kind of assumption that kind of culture has gone just one way, and it used to be like, incredibly, Christian, and now it's not. But actually holding a kind of biblical view of those things 2,000 years ago would have made you incredibly countercultural.
Yes.
And so we're kind of rediscovering that to an extent.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. I think maybe we need to have more of a willingness to say things that we know are not really popular. I think there's a danger, I think, sometimes in Christian circles that basically whenever an issue becomes unsayable, we literally, we're not going to say anything on that subject because it's controversial. I think we need to be wise, and I think we don't just go in to talk about controversial things just to be controversial. But equally, if we're not willing to speak on stuff because we fear that it might engender a reaction, then I think, well, we need to check whose approval we're looking for ultimately.
Which is a real revolution, I think, in what evangelism is, because I think I by default have this view of evangelism that it's basically you take the temperature of the room and you're instantly able to kind of ingratiate yourself to this audience and chameleon-like kind of reflect their values back to themselves, and then say, and Jesus, which actually, at the end of the day, that's kind of, there's a phrase that describes that in the Bible. It's called fear of man.
Mm.
Um, and I was really struck by that when I was preparing some stuff on Revelation, and it's the church at Laodicea, isn't it? That is neither hot nor cold, and I will spit it out of my mouth. And I was thinking, oh, it's room temperature then, and like no one likes a cup of room temperature tea, but if you've got toddlers running around, that's the only kind of tea you're ever drinking. It's room temperature because you've laid it down and you're returning to it several hours later. But room temperature is, you have accommodated the room. You have set your bar to where the room's bar is, and Jesus is like, no, that is absolutely not the way. And I just wonder whether we've become room temperature Christians, when actually we should be prophetically speaking an alien message that doesn't sound like it's coming from the left or the right, but is coming from above.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think in some ways we're forced into that at the moment because we're doing stuff online rather than in person. If you're speaking to a particular audience, it's quite easy, isn't it, to look at your audience and think, this is kind of what's going to be acceptable. This is what's not going to be acceptable to say in this particular university, this particular environment, or age group or whatever, and then say the stuff that we know that's going to be popular. Whereas you stick stuff out on the internet and basically anyone can watch it, and you see that you'll have reactions. So in a way that's good, because it just means it's much harder to play the room when the room is the world.
Yes. I've noticed a lot of people, a lot of preachers have said they've appreciated the fact that it's just them and the camera when they're recording their sermon. They've actually been able to be bolder than they usually are in person, and sometimes that means they've been a little bit tone deaf in the way they've said things. But we are kidding ourselves if we don't think that fear of men and our massive desire to be liked doesn't shape what we say and how we say it. On campus and with students, have you noticed any changes over the years in terms of the sorts of questions that people are bringing, or the sorts of issues that people think are important?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I've been doing student ministry for about 15, 16 years. And I guess it was at the time of kind of the rise of the new atheists when I began. So God Delusion just been published, everyone was reading it. And so there was a kind of real obvious hostility towards the Christian faith that you met. And the kind of questions people were asking were the classical objections of, if there's a good God, why does he allow suffering? How could God send people to hell? What about other religions, etc.? Which kind of all assume a certain level of knowledge of the Christian faith to know what your objections should be. Jesus does make exclusive claims, and that there is such a thing as hell, and so on. So I think that was the kind of world we lived in. I think we've seen the decline of new atheism. I mean, Richard Dawkins is not the kind of influence that he was, and I don't meet hardly any students these days who would kind of express views similar to his, whereas that was really common when I started.
Do you think he ever was as influential as Christian evangelists like you and me made him out to be?
He certainly was more than he is today. So you would meet students who would not necessarily, even having read his book, regurgitate ideas that had kind of come commonplace at the time, because his book was quite popular in certain circles. But at the same time, I still wonder whether we were kind of aiming our events at a niche of kind of angry atheists who engaged in those kind of questions, whilst a lot of students just looked at those questions and went, I'm not really interested. But I think even more so now. So I think the challenge today is that partly because most students have had no kind of Christian background, their parents didn't even have a Christian background, they're not rebelling against the Christianity of their parents, which is what was happening 20 years ago. They're just agnostic, mostly, rather than atheistic, and don't know enough of the Christian faith even to know what their objections to it should be. Jesus is the only way, really? I think that has changed. So I think the kind of questions that people are asking today are more life questions. So we kind of reflect that now in some of the titles we would use. So instead of, why would God allow suffering? Is there any purpose in my pain?
Right.
Or instead of, how can Jesus be the only way? How can we have harmony in a world of competing truth claims? Those kind of more general questions that people might be asking as they reflect upon culture. Questions like, do humans deserve human rights? That's been a talk that was really popular over the
Yes.
last few years. So yeah, I think there has been a change, I think, in campus culture in the last
Yes.
few years.
And I think it can be an opportunity. I think you can go two ways with that. You can see, oh, um, our hearers don't know the first thing about Christianity. Therefore, I need to start so far back and just, discuss the concept of, is there such a thing as truth or not? And then, by the Friday night, we might get to something about Jesus. Or you could take the view, oh, they don't know the first thing about Christianity. Well, let's at least send up a flare from the very heart of the Christian faith and say, over this way. This is like whatever we're trying to help you grope towards. This is it. This is the central thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think we've gotten it wrong. Sometimes I think we've because people know so little. We start so far back, and when we just do a talk on, is there such a thing as objective truth, the non-Christian doesn't know you're trying to lead them by the hand to Jesus. They just think you're trying to lead them by the hand to modernism or something, and so so I'm a big believer in sort of, because people know so little, let's do what, especially in the UK, students are brilliant at getting gospels into people's hands and saying let's crack them open and get down to brass tacks. Here's Jesus, and I think that there are real opportunities in amidst the confusion. Would you say?
Absolutely, and I think Jesus is incredibly attractive. As you show people Jesus in the Gospels, that is magnetic. And as you say, I think sometimes we've started so far back, people have kind of objected to what we're saying because they don't know where we're trying to lead them, and they think we're trying to lead them to something that they don't want to go to, and it's like, no. So I guess my philosophy of how I go about doing a university mission week is we would try and engage with questions that are the kind of questions people are asking. So the title of the talk is not going to be who is Jesus, because that's not a question that most students are asking on campus. But every talk title in the talk itself, I'd want to bring people to some aspect of the heart of the gospel, to Jesus. I'll probably do that increasingly as the week goes on. So yeah, you might be really homing in on the resurrection and the cross, towards the end of the week. But at the same time, I want to be doing that from Monday. I don't want to kind of, I heard of a mission week that took place in a different part of Europe, and basically Jesus wasn't mentioned until the Friday, literally not mentioned. And most people weren't there by Friday because they just got bored.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, without Jesus, it's all dull, isn't it? Yeah. So Jesus might not be the heart of the question that's asked, but he's the heart of the answer that you're giving. And that's very good. So in the midst of all this cancel culture, and in the midst of real tumult in the world, and political views are now, I said on the last podcast that, with the death of God, Nietzsche's term, there's a power vacuum. The political becomes sacred. And so politics is this incredibly heated debate between, demonic figures and angelic figures. And it's a heaven or hell discussion all of a sudden. And then entertainment and sport and stuff gets raised up to the level of the political. And everything becomes incredibly preachy. How do we avoid mentioning the political? Do we avoid wading into these topics that everyone is talking about? Or if we do engage them, how do we go about it?
Yeah, I think there's a tension there. I think historically, a lot of people would have said, you don't engage in politics at all. Let's leave that to one side. We're here to present the gospel and not engage in those issues. And I mean, historically, someone like Billy Graham was an example of that. He was very clear that he wasn't going to kind of get involved in politics. That wasn't his role. He met with the presidents of America, I think, all the way through to, I can't remember who the last one he met with was, but so he would engage with politicians, but he would never engage in kind of expressing political views. Many people would say that his son Franklin has done the very opposite, in that his political views seem to be very obvious. And is a problem because of that for many people, because it's now aligned, the Christian faith with one particular political party.
Mm.
I think there's dangers in both. I think if we align the gospel with one political party or one political view, we can maybe unnecessarily alienate people of the other political view. And the gospel doesn't. I think we can come back to that, just align itself with the left or the right politically. And it will connect with bits of both, and it will challenge bits of both. But equally, I think one of the problems today is that, as you say, because politics has been so elevated to kind of fill this void that God needs to fill almost, politics is no longer just a political view. For many people, it is a belief system. It's a way of viewing the whole world. It's a way of understanding their hopes for the future and so on. And so, as an evangelist, we've got to engage in people's worldview. We've got to engage in what people are thinking. And so, to say I'm not going to talk about politics in the current climate is basically saying I'm not going to engage in anyone else's worldview, which, as an evangelist, I'd say is wrong. 15 years ago, we were engaging with the worldview of people like Richard Dawkins and the new atheism, because that was a worldview that many people would espouse and adhere to. But behind a lot of what's happening today, there is a worldview, there is a clear philosophy, and I think we kind of need to engage in that to show that the gospel is better.
Yes, yeah. And maybe going back to that, the way that we engaged the new atheism, I think there were better ways and worse ways of doing that. I think some of the better ways of doing that was to acknowledge what was good about the new atheism, and to say, look, the God in whom the new atheists do not believe certainly does not exist, and hallelujah because of that. That the power in the sky that they're shaking their fist at does not exist, and if such a creature, such a super being within the created order, if that was what God was, then we would be anti-theists too. And I think some of the better engagements with the new atheism not only reacted against it, but also identified some of the very natural, human, and correct impulses that were behind it. Are there ways that we can do the same as we look out at the political turmoil going on today?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's hard is labeling what's going on in some ways, because the moment you say it's this, someone says no, it's not. So there are all sorts of kind of labels and words that get banded around: neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism, critical race theory, and so on. And they're all getting at something, but the moment we start labeling it, someone's going to say, I'm not that. But so I think it's better to take ideas and maybe commonly repeated kind of concepts and terminology and engage with those. So you looked at this the other week, the idea of privilege, for instance. It's very easy just to immediately kind of throw out any talk of white privilege and say, this is all rubbish. But at the same time, it is helpful to say, well, actually, life isn't fair, is it? And that helpfully acknowledges that for some people, there are real disadvantages that they face. And how do we make sense of that?
And what should we do? We who are strong should bear with the failings of the weak, Romans 15. That actually, 2,000 years earlier, Paul had beaten us to the punch and said there are privileges that people have. He was loath to identify them purely with race, obviously, but there are such things as privileges, and what should we do with them? We should sacrifice them for the sake of those with less. So identifying those kernels that can be helpful, kind of.
Kind of similar to that, there's a real emphasis on listening to people's stories, and engaging, and the need to be empathetic and understand where people are coming from. And I think on one level, we're going to say absolutely, surely as evangelists, we need to be listening to where people are coming from, seeking to really understand not only what people think, but why people might think the way they think. But at the same time, there's a danger in that, isn't there, when we say basically we can never question someone's story because this is their lived experience. It must be objectively true, everything they're saying. So we kind of need to identify, but also push back, and challenge where challenge is needed.
Yes. What is Dan Stranger's phrase about that? What does he talk about? It's sort of a cross and resurrection movement. I'll Google it. I'll Google it in a second, and who knows how I'll edit this video later. I might seem like it's on the tip of my tongue, but yeah. So we can look out at some of these issues, and we can. So what you're making a case for is, okay, these are belief systems, and interestingly, Islam is a belief system that is also very political. I mean, you cannot. There is no sacred secular divide within Islam. The sacred secular divide is the gift of Christianity to the world. You look at other religions, and within Islam, that is also a political ideology. When you look at Hinduism, there are Hindu nationalist movements that are like, well, of course, the religious and the political is entirely bound up with one another. And so it shouldn't surprise us, actually, that people are taking on political views as though they have existential significance. So we do want to engage with that. How do we do that without being a kind of a party political mouthpiece?
And I think that's the challenge. So the danger is that we just look like we are the opposite political opinion. I think for me, one of the things I'm trying to do, and I don't always get this right, and there's always a danger that we do that. But I think one of the things I try and do is challenge, to an extent, both ends of the political spectrum. So, for instance, if we're only challenging, what we perceive as the far left, then the danger is people perceive that what we're obviously advocating is, the right or the far right.
Right.
So to be able to say, well, actually, there's a danger with both these ends. So I guess something I was thinking about last week was the letter that was signed by 150 distinguished people, some of whom unsigned themselves from it when they realised who else was on it. But this letter basically concern for freedom of speech, and I guess you'd look at that and some people would say, well, the desire for and the concern for freedom of speech is a concern that generally people on the right are kind of talking about a lot. And people on the left,
historically, it had been a left thing.
But in the current climate. But then on the left, you've got people saying, actually, we need to be compassionate. We need to love people. We need equality, and we're fearful of freedom of speech because we see how it's used sometimes to basically be really hurtful as an excuse to be able to be obnoxious. And so to be able to challenge both and say, well, actually, we need, love without truth is problematic, but then truth without love is problematic, and actually we need to bring both together, which is exactly what the Bible does. So the Bible challenges those who on maybe the left are saying, we don't need freedom of speech because we just need to be compassionate, but equally it challenges those on the right who say, let's just say as many obnoxious things as possible because we can. And actually it's presenting a third way. So I think the challenge is to be able to say, let's look at both ends of a political spectrum. Let's identify where we can, let's challenge where we can, and let's try and show that the gospel is neither left nor right politically, but it is showing a unique way that Jesus is different to both.
Does it help you do so much of your mission in Eastern Europe? Because I'm challenged by and helped by brothers who have experienced communism in living memory, and who now, perhaps in places like Hungary or in Russia, are experiencing sort of hard man kind of alternatives to that as well. And there are a lot of Christians who kind of look over to Western Europe and look over to the States and places and say, okay, sometimes you Christians, you're happy when, the left looks silly, but watch out because you don't want the hard right either. And actually, and the gospel is something different. Does it help you that you're sort of traversing a whole bunch of different cultures that have different experiences of left and right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really helpful chatting to a friend of mine who leads the student ministry in Serbia, and he was just saying, you need to be really careful that you don't attach the gospel to one political view, because you can really alienate others. And in a part of the world where there's been massive tensions between countries, if you view, you know, the gospel as being aligned to my, you know, political views, you can really alienate people, particularly in other parts of that Balkan region. And I think they've shown actually that by keeping the gospel central, by not attaching it to one view or another, they can have a real unity. And, you know, to see the student leader in Serbia sitting down best friends with the student leader in Albania, two people who, for every good reason, should hate each other, given the histories of those nations and what's happened in those nations, you see actually this is what the gospel can do. But they recognise that there is a danger that that, you know, we can too easily jump on a bandwagon and then regret it in years to come.
That's powerful. That's powerful. So let's talk about something that you did on Facebook, I guess a couple of weeks ago now, sort of speaking into the issue of statues. After the statue of a slaveholder was taken down in Bristol and thrown into the river, this was on everyone's minds. And Motzi, the great evangelist, was thinking what?
Yeah, so I guess I was just thinking over what was going on and seeing this kind of debate. So you've got on the one side people and many Christian friends, you know, celebrating that, you know, all of these symbols of oppression were being destroyed and that this was a really wonderful thing. And then, you know, other equally good Christian friends saying this is absolutely terrible and we're getting rid of our history and we shouldn't be getting rid of statues and, you know, put them back. And I'm looking at that saying, hang on, you know, these are people who love Jesus, but have very different opinions about this issue. And I guess the temptation is to wade in and take one side over the other. And I was trying to think, okay, well, what are the underlying issues here? And is there something that can be said into this situation? So I was trying to be really careful not to say, yes, we should, or no, we shouldn't. In fact, I said that this is not ultimately what I'm writing about. I'm not of the opinion that you can never take down a statue. You know, my ancestors lived in Estonia, and you know, the Estonians quite liked removing symbols of Soviet oppression. So, so yeah, that's not saying you should never do that. But equally, there's, you know, arguments about question then how far do you go? And I guess the underlying assumption is if you're going to divide the world into the oppressed and the oppressors, which is kind of very much the underlying kind of belief system behind what's going on today. You're either oppressed or you're an oppressor. There's some real tensions there when you find that some people are oppressed and oppressors. So there was this fascinating situation where Sadiq Khan had basically said that he was going to have an inquiry into the removal of statues and the renaming of certain places in London that were linked with oppression. But just, I think, 2 years before, he had revealed, or unveiled rather, this statue of Millicent Fawcett, who was a suffragette, who obviously, as a woman standing against the oppression of women, was very much a symbol of the oppressed speaking against the oppressors. But, as it turned out, she was also involved in the Boer War in South Africa and her actions led to the deaths of thousands of Black Africans in that situation. Mm-hmm. And so in that situation, as a white person, she was also the oppressor.
Right.
So what do we do when we...
You mean she wasn't just a sinless saint? You mean...
Yeah. So
mean the world doesn't just divide into heroes and villains?
Yeah, and so there's a challenge, isn't it? So where do we go? You know, if we're going to start purging history of those who cause oppression, I mean, ultimately you purge history of everyone. Mm-hmm. Which might be what we end up with. So whether or not it's right to pull down a statue, the underlying assumption is this idea of oppressed, oppressor, and what does that reveal about human nature? So then I just read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is fascinating. And the reason why I read the book was I've always used that wonderful quote about the dividing line between good and evil going down the heart of every human being. And I thought, well, I can't really use this quote without reading the context. Unfortunately, the context...
Don't convict me, Motzi. It's a long book. I'm going to have to...
It's an audio book that takes 24 hours to listen to. So I basically spent the first half of lockdown in a Soviet jail. So I read this book, and but actually in the context, it's even more powerful. And he talks about before we literally throw people out, as before we discard people, we come up short as we reflect on our own lives and who we are. So I basically wrote the piece. I just filmed a really short video, like literally in kind of 5 minutes, just before I went to bed, stuck it online, and like the next day, this had gone to a degree viral. I mean, I think the post got shared 400 times. The video got, I think, 10,000 views within a couple of days, and loads of comments. And I think what was kind of encouraging in some ways was that many of our friends who are not Christian were saying, actually, this is really interesting. That really helpfully kind of makes sense of what's going on, and it was also pointing people ultimately to Jesus.
How did it do that? Make that step for us. So imagine you get into a conversation and your friend agrees with Solzhenitsyn. Yes, we're all mixed bags, and there's evil within us. What do you then say?
Yeah, so I think my jump from Solzhenitsyn was to say, well, actually, Solzhenitsyn was really articulating an idea that was expressed 2,000 years before. And then I looked at Mark 7, where Jesus talks about out of the heart come evil thoughts and so on. So actually, this is a very Christian idea that the problem with the world is not external. It's not simply in the structures around us, but it's also within us, in our hearts. And therefore, if we want to change the world, we can't do that simply by changing structures. It's not that we don't get involved in politics, but actually it's people's hearts and lives that need to be changed. And that is what the Christian faith offers. It offers internal transformation. And so actually I finished by just talking about John Newton, the slave trader who came to know Christ, the beautiful hymn, Amazing Grace, and this idea that actually in Jesus, people really can be radically transformed from the inside, which is, I think, a wonderful hope. And I think one of the things I've been really struck by recently is that there's a lot of anger, but there's not a lot of hope that people can change. So I was just reading So You Want to Talk About Race, by a woman whose name I can't pronounce right now, sorry. But I was encouraged to read that by someone who was disagreeing with me on a conversation we're having on social media. And it just struck me in the beginning, she was saying, there are people who are out and out racists, who really hate people. This book isn't designed for them because I can't do miracles. And it just really struck me, her admission that actually, if you are really an out and out racist that hates people of colour, like I can't do anything for you. And I just recently read the book by Tom Tarrant, his biography, Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. A man who was an out and out racist, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, America's most wanted criminal at one stage, or Mississippi's most wanted criminal, who really was transformed, not by magic, but by a miracle of God's grace. And so saying, actually, we do believe in a God who can really change people's lives, and not just, in a small way, but in a really, really radical way.
Yeah. I think that's a really good example of subversive fulfillment. I've Googled what Dan Stranger's phrase was: subversive fulfillment, in which you do end up saying, okay, so what these people are grasping towards is good, but you've got to actually subvert their initial desires and show how they're seeking that goal in the wrong way. And then actually in the gospel, there is a fulfillment of that hope. So it is a cross and resurrection, subversive fulfillment kind of movement. And I think there's a wrong way of the church kind of jumping on bandwagons. It could be really easy to simply, everyone's talking about race. Let us now talk about race, without caring about racial reconciliation in our own churches and figuring out, what would that look like in my church here and now? And so the danger of sort of virtue signaling and that sort of thing. But then there's the danger also of kind of saying, jumping on the bandwagon, as opposed to saying, hey, this book's been saying this stuff for thousands of years, and it's really cool that the world is catching up to this idea of racial harmony. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. But the world is reflecting something that the Bible's been on about prior to that. So not jumping on the bandwagon that the world has jumped on, but actually going back to the beginning and saying, actually, in Jesus, there is a racial harmony and a racial reconciliation beyond anything that the anti-racist movements of this world has ever, dreamt of. Because my fear is not just with the race issue, but with all sorts of issues. The church just jumps on a bandwagon that's already heading somewhere, and gives it a lightly baptizes it, and off we go.
It's like, the Bible also says something about this kind of thing. And not engaging in a deeper way. It's interesting. I think it was Tom Holland. I can't remember. It was in an interview, but basically saying, Tom Holland, the historian, that we wouldn't have got woke if it wasn't for the gospel, if it wasn't for Christianity.
Right.
So all of these kind of issues that we now passionately are concerned about, we're concerned about because of Christianity. But one of the problems is we've detached the fruit from the root. So we take the fruit of the Christian worldview, whether it's this desire for equality or whatever, but detached from the root of the gospel, it basically becomes kind of God in itself. And then it becomes this absolute. But it was never designed to be the ultimate. It was designed to be the fruit of something bigger than itself. And so I think you see that in the battle between freedom of speech and, say, compassion or equality.
Right.
Both of those things are a fruit of the Christian worldview in the West. But when you detach either of them from the gospel, they can become means ultimately of actually oppressing others, ironically.
Yes, yeah. I think about the ideals of the French Revolution, and we're being reminded more and more of the Reign of Terror. But the French Revolution is kind of summarized as liberty, equality, and fraternity. But that kind of pursuit was very much the fruit of the gospel working on France over centuries and centuries and centuries. And then, but take God out of the equation, and those things totally pull against one another. Liberty and equality very famously work in different directions, because if I'm free to do whatever I want to do, then the outcome of that will be wildly unequal to the outcome of somebody else doing that. And if that's the way we're pulling apart, how on earth are we going to get fraternity? These three ideals are just they're actually beautifully Christian. But you've got to do the subversive fulfillment, and you've got to say, no, you cannot have this without Jesus. But in Jesus, he liberates us, sits us all down at the same table together, even with our crunchy differences that are not smushed together, but are allowed to be, the particular differences that we have, as we are all brothers and sisters, sharing in the same meal. And actually, come to Jesus, you get liberty, equality, and fraternity. Apart from Jesus, we just pull against one another, and those three ideals actually become competitors of one another. But you've got to do a lot of work of subverting it and then fulfilling it.
Absolutely. But I was really struck by I can't remember which of Alistair McGrath's books it's in, but he quotes a woman who was being executed at the guillotine in the French Revolution, Madame Roland, and she, as she goes up to be executed, she says, "Liberty, liberty, what evils have been committed in thy name." And this idea, you take this idea which is good, but then it becomes this means of oppression because you've detached it from where it came.
Yeah, exactly. So, Motsi, what's your hope? So, are you going to move into political commentary? Are you going to be a pundit? As you've been reflecting on these things moving forwards, are you going to do more Facebook posts like this? What do you think are the pros and cons of wading into this area?
Yeah, I think it's something I've been reflecting on. It's interesting. There are some comments, people say, "This is great, do more of this." Other people saying, "Shut up, you don't know what you're on about. You shouldn't be speaking on these things. Go back to doing what you do best." So I guess there's a tension there. And I think, I'm not sure. I've never had this kind of clear kind of like, this is what the next 5 years are going to look like of ministry. I guess I've just kind of responded to stuff as things have happened. But I guess one of the things I want to do is just say that, is there something we can say uniquely about Jesus and to show that the gospel is good? And can we connect that with what's going on? And so to the extent that comes up, and that seems like a legitimate thing we can do, that is something I'd love to do. I think there's a danger we just kind of get stuck on one issue, and there are all sorts of issues that we want to engage with. Obviously, in recent weeks, the issue of equality, Black Lives Matter, everything else has been particularly kind of headline news. I mean, there's not been a lot in headline news this year, really, has it? It's just like coronavirus, and then Black Lives Matter, like the two things in 7 months. But, you know, there will be other things that come up. But I think trying to say something, but equally just recognizing the dangers. So, you know, there's always the temptation to just want to wade in just for the sake of a political discussion.
Yeah.
And so I think it's always a good question to ask is to say, what's my purpose in doing this and what will it achieve?
Yeah.
And can I do, and as a Christian and as an evangelist, what can I uniquely bring to this conversation that isn't already being contributed by a million other people on Twitter angrily shouting backwards and forwards?
Yes.
And I guess that was what I felt with the statues post. I felt there's all sorts of debate going on here, but is there something I can say that is different to what is already being said? And in that situation, I felt, yeah.
Yes.
So.
Yes. And those are some good questions that we should all ask before we kind of make our announcements. As you know, we're all treating ourselves like we are the ambassador, and you know, my daily press briefing as we tweet it out to the world.
Can I throw it back the other way to you, Glen? Because obviously you did this post about Dominic Cummings. That was the other news.
I remember him. Yes.
Yeah. But again, that's a situation where, you know, even amongst my Christian friends, there would be a really strong diversity of opinion.
Yes.
The Dominic defenders and the Let's Kill Dominic campaign.
Yes.
And you did a really helpful post that got shared very widely in response to that. What was your thinking in trying to how to respond to that kind of highly political situation as a Christian?
I think I'm a bit odd, but because I saw it was so charged, I thought to myself, "Hello, what's going on here?" There were clearly, it clearly touched a nerve. I mean, at very minimum, it touched a nerve. I think we're talking about, you know, levels of hysteria that were probably brought on by lockdown and all that kind of stuff. We're all staring at the same four walls for however many weeks. There was a craze about the issue, I felt. And so obviously, you know, the fearful side of you says, therefore, shut up, Glen. But then the more antagonistic side of me thought to myself, no, there's something deeper than this. And I guess what I wanted to do in the post was just point out all the standards we are holding Dominic Cummings to. And what do you notice about all the standards that we're holding Dominic Cummings to? You know, there is a law above us and nobody is above the law. Okay, that's interesting. The spirit of the law is more important than the letter of the law. And people were saying that just commonly. And you're like, oh, hello. Hypocrisy is intolerable. Like, oh, that's interesting. Self-justification is ugly. Everyone was saying, you know, he should just admit his own errors. That's not a weakness, that's a strength, admitting your own errors. You're like, oh, that's interesting. You know, the leaders should be held to a higher account and they should serve others. And, you know, and even if he's the innocent one in this, he should probably fall on his sword and sacrifice himself for the good of the people. And you're like, hang on a minute. I've heard that before. It's like, it's entirely Christian. And so really, I mean, Tom Holland's Dominion has kind of helped me massively in that, just to see that the water we swim in is utterly Christian. And whether you're right or left, globalist, nationalist, wherever you're coming from on the political spectrum, you are judging everything through the spectacles of the Bible. And, you know, I think one of my phrases was, you know, we're basically hurling proof texts at one another. We've just forgot the references. And that's been my view for a while. You know, when we were debating whether to bomb Syria or not, literally on the one side there were people who were just sounding entirely like the Sermon on the Mount, and people on the other and so turn the other cheek and let's be pacifists. And on the other side they were sounding entirely like Romans 13 and Augustine's just war tradition, and no one said anything that wasn't utterly Christian. Like whichever side, you know, we are all within this thing called Christianity, like tearing each other apart, using standards that are totally Christian. But without Jesus, those standards make, you know, no sense whatsoever. Who cares if you're a hypocrite? If, you know, like, Jesus made us care about hypocrisy in a way that, ancient peoples just didn't care. Why should leaders serve others? Like, apart from the Jesus story, you don't get leaders serving other people. Where do you get this idea about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, et cetera, et cetera? And to the degree that you walk away from the roots of Christianity, you're not allowed to have the fruits. Sorry. So that was kind of what I was trying to do, and trying to tap into this meaning crisis that we have. We massively have a meaning crisis. We don't have an overarching narrative that we live our lives by, and we're just turning on each other, lashing out. And ever more, I'm seeing it's either come back to Jesus or it's this hell of your own devising. Which will it be? And it sounds like a bigoted fundamentalism, doesn't it, to say it's Jesus or the pit, it's Jesus or hell. But I just think, even politically, historically, sociologically, that's just true. To the degree that you walk away from Jesus, you're walking into just the hatred and the self-justification and tearing one another apart. So that's my angle on these things, I think.
But I think it was so helpful because it kind of showed that, where there's a temptation just to wade in and kind of express one's political views. And I think the thing is, we all do probably have kind of a hunch when it comes to any of these situations of, what we think, and, one way or the other. But actually to kind of almost resist the temptation just to kind of say what everyone else is saying, or at least half people are saying, and to try and connect with both sides and to see where it's coming from. And I think that point, Tom Holland makes so brilliantly in Dominion is that, we're not, in one sense, everyone's been saying, for the last 20 years in terms of like missiology and mission, like we're in this post-Christian society and, we're no longer kind of shaped by the Bible. And to an extent, yes, but to an extent, absolutely not, because, we're so much more Christian in our outlook in a sense than we think.
Which is why I think those human rights talks that you mentioned really resonate with people, because we just take it for granted. We take it as an article of faith that every human has near infinite dignity and worth and is equal in some sense, which is the most magical thinking imaginable if you don't believe in the Jesus story.
Absolutely. And it's just, it's interesting chatting to a couple of students. The first time I did the talk was at Leeds University, and a couple of students had literally come from a lecture on human rights. And they were like, we came from a lecture and now we saw another talk on human rights and we came to your talk. And they said, no one ever said anything it had to do with, no one ever said it had anything to do with Christianity. Like literally, they've been in this like course on human rights for kind of weeks. Yeah. And no one had kind of thought what was the philosophical basis to this idea. It's all.
Yeah. And Tom Holland says that demonstrates the success of Christianity, that no one thinks it's anything Christian. It's just a water we swim in, Yeah.
But if you read, Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, he's
got on over your left shoulder. There it is.
Yeah, well placed. Yeah, that leads to lots of conversations when you're doing live talks. Someone says, "I've noticed you have *Sapiens*. What do you think about that book?" But to look at that book, he would just say, well, "Look, this is a uniquely Christian idea. It's a myth. It's not true because he doesn't believe it is true. But he's very consistent to agree because he's saying actually, you can't really have this without the philosophy that underlies it."
Yeah. He's saying God is a myth and human rights are a myth. And he's saying they're not true. On the other hand, you've got Tom Holland, who's over my right shoulder somewhere. He says God is a myth and human rights are a myth in a much richer, deeper sense that doesn't mean never happened.
Yes.
And we will see where that journey takes Tom Holland, but he's leaning in the opposite direction, I think, to Harari. But they're both making that same point.
I mean, the irony to a degree with Harari is that obviously he kind of says it's a good myth. It's good that we've got this idea of human rights, and he's glad that we live in a world where it exists. He also acknowledges that myths only work if the majority of the population don't think that they're myths. Yeah. And so by writing one of the world's bestsellers, telling everyone that human rights is a myth, surely he's kind of undermining the very basis of Western civilization that he kind of likes.
It reminds me of Brett Weinstein, who did a debate with Alistair McGrath recently on Unbelievable. And obviously Brett Weinstein is part of the intellectual dark web, and he's an evolutionary psychologist. He's an atheist. And he says we need something to sit in the place that religion once held. Obviously, we can't, believe in the metaphysical truth claims of religion anymore. I honestly don't think he's ever spent more than 30 seconds examining the metaphysical truth claims of Christianity. I honestly don't, people, that's just a feature of academic life and specialisms. But he says obviously we must reject the metaphysics of religion, but we need something to take its place. But Brett Weinstein himself is a real example of what it is that takes the place of Christianity. Could well tear you apart, as it did, at his college where he was teaching in Evergreen in Washington State. And he's now, you've got a very fascinating podcast looking out at a world tearing itself apart. And I'd just love some time with Brett Weinstein to say, yeah, and what is this thing that's going to take the place? Because time is running out. Or maybe we should just go back to this thing. It seems to have worked. Yeah. And therefore, let's just preach our hearts out, actually. Yes, we cannot help but touch on the political, because A, the political is the religious for so many people who we're talking to, and B, the political has been shaped by the Jesus story for 2,000 years. So we can't help but say things that touch on the political. But also, let's just preach our hearts out, because like this meaning crisis is serious, and the world's going to tear itself apart without Jesus.
Absolutely. And we'll take whatever issue that is there to kind of connect people to the gospel. But I think the key is we want to start there, but actually want to take people to Jesus, right. and we can do that in all sorts of ways. And I think that it's the model of the Book of Acts, isn't it? You can start in any different place, but every sermon in the Book of Acts starts where people are at, but it leads people to Jesus.
Yes,
and that's what we kind of want to do with. And I think the beauty is we can show that we can literally do that with anything.
Yes.
Because the gospel is the story of what God's doing in the whole world. So there's nothing outside or disconnected from it.
Yes.
And I think it's a helpful discipleship thing as well, isn't it, for Christians to see, oh yeah, there's no issues that kind of fall outside the realm of, the gospel.
Right.
Everything's connected, and therefore I can think Christianly about everything.
Yeah. And actually, I was preaching on Acts 4 last Sunday, and it talks about there are Sadducees there, and as Paul was preaching about the resurrection of Jesus, the Pharisees were sort of upset about the Jesus bit. The Sadducees were upset about the resurrection bit. And then there's the temple guards, and there are all these factions that are sort of fighting it out within Israel. And it was just interesting to think that those were also political factions. Those were also sociological movements, as well as theological movements. And Peter and Paul, they knew how to use that at times. Paul, when he's on trial, he spots that there's some Pharisees and some Sadducees. So he raises the issue of the resurrection of the dead to start a fight between them, because that served the gospel. So interesting that the nous of the disciples was not just, they preached the gospel and therefore all the other political machinations they didn't care about. Actually, they were wise to that, and they were able to use that for gospel purposes.
And I think that's really helpful, isn't it? Because you see that there are real tensions and conflict. Douglas Murray in The Madness of Crowds helpfully kind of shows people think that there's this kind of united, kind of joined up thinking about where we're heading in this progressive culture. Yeah. And he says, but actually it's going to eat itself alive, because you've got trans rights people on one side, you've got feminists on another, and you can see it right now before our eyes. Yeah. It's, and so you've kind of got a biblical example there, haven't you, where you've got two very strongly held views, and they're able to just stand back and say, hang on a minute, this doesn't work, does it? Yeah. What kind of worldview could you have that could bring together all of these desires and concerns and ultimately fulfill them, but in, like you say, a subversive way?
Yeah, it's an interesting book, Madness of Crowds, because Douglas Murray's got this sort of analogy that he keeps using. It was like the train was pulling into the station in the 1990s, and all the race issues and the gender issues and the sexuality issues were perfectly, that was fine, it was settled, and then the train went careering through the station and just sort of crashed on through. And I kept on thinking as I was reading that, well, actually, what if the problem was a bit earlier than that?
Yeah.
What if we went off the rails a little bit earlier than that, and that might explain the fact that we weren't just pulling into a station of rest in the 1990s, and now we've gone careering through into things. And reading with the Tom Holland kind of spectacles on, I think we went off the rails before then.
Yeah. But I think what's really helpful, I mean, the best bit for me in that book was just his bit about forgiveness, where he just says, we've kept some vestiges of a Christian worldview in terms of this idea of guilt, but we've lost the idea of redemption and forgiveness. And what do we do in a culture like that? And you see it played out on social media as people lose their jobs over things that they posted 20 years ago and stuff like that.
Brilliant. Michael Otts, how can people catch up with you, read more of your stuff, see some of these videos on Facebook, perhaps?
Yeah. So if you find me on Facebook, I am Michael Otts, OTS. I have a very liberal friendship policy. If you look,
even I qualify. Yeah,
even Glen is the friend. I've got a YouTube channel that's kind of increasingly getting a few more videos on it. So that's just youtube.com/Michael Otts. I've got a website, michaelotts.com, and you can go there. And I've written 3 books. If you Google them, I'm sure you'll find them. And I'm sure 10 of those will do you a good deal.
They always do a good deal. Michael Otts, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.